Hello and welcome to Northern Nightmares. I'm your host Andrew, and this week we continue our journey through history, exploring the world's worst pandemics. For part 2, we're going to the early 19th century, during another horrifying time for humans. Just near the end of World War I, the world got hit with the Spanish flu. But for this episode, I figured, besides the pandemic, this would be a good time to dive into the war. For this first half of the story, let's look at the horrors the world was experiencing, the soldiers and everything that happened during the Great War. Then for the final half, we'll look at our main topic, to which is the Spanish flu, in which this pandemic had a death count in the millions globally. This story may not be as funny as I made last week's, but I'll try to lighten the mood when appropriate. So buckle up, grab your helmets, and prepare to dive into the trenches. For at this time, this was called the Great War, and afterwards people thought the nightmares were over. Oh, how they were so wrong when the Spanish flu arrived at their shores. July 28, 1914, the war to end wars would begin, or at least people thought so at this time. Before the world experienced World War II, in 1939, World War I was called the Great War. This included the Allies and the Central Powers. The Allies involved the countries of the French Republic, United Kingdom, the Russian Empire, the US, and the Empire of Japan. Canada was also included, but we flew under the command of the British. The Central Powers included the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Bulgaria, and Italy as well. Now, for the record, I'm not a historian or an expert on World War I, so I'm going to try and keep it simple. Before the war kicked off, there were growing tensions throughout Europe. Basically, a bunch of countries with a power trip trying to control each other. The major trigger that kicked things in motion was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Now, if you remember from the Halifax explosion episode, I talked briefly of this event, but I'm going to give you the Coles notes before we go into the horrors of the war. On October 8th, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. This little country in the southeastern part of Europe. Austria-Hungary was an empire. Both countries were located in the central area of Europe. These two countries ruled hand in hand from 1867 to 1918. When they took over Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, people of the nation were pissed. A new movement started to rise up and rebel against their new rulers, and this was known as the Young Bosnia. They were supplied with weapons from an extremist group that was located within Serbia. This was the Black Hand Intelligence Organization. Now that the Young Bosnia group had been fully equipped to fully overthrow the empire, they would eventually plan out the assassination of the Archduke. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke would visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's on this day that the Young Bosnia would roll up to the Archduke's car. One of the members threw a grenade at his car. However, they were unsuccessful. Only 2 of his aides were injured. An hour later, Franz left the hospital after visiting his soldiers. He took a wrong turn into a street where one of the Young Bosnia members were there. He opened fire on Franz and his wife Sophie, killing the couple. This event put everything in motion, what would be later the Great War. Now, this caused Austria-Hungary to issue an ultimatum to Serbia, because if they didn't supply guns to Young Bosnia, this may not have happened. However, their demands were never accepted by Serbia, as they felt they would lose their independence. This then fueled the July crisis, when Austria-Hungary was backed up by Germany, and would involve them acting against Serbia. Serbia attempted offering new negotiations. However, their enemies were craving blood. With this set the Great War into motion. Due to the complex system of alliances through Europe, the continent was divided. Following Austria-Hungary's declaration of war, the other nations were deciding who to side with. Russia mobilized their troops in defense of Serbia, and Germany was against this action, so they declared war on Russia. It was then France backed up Russia against the Germans. Germany would later declare war on France as well. However, they would piss off other nations due to this. To arrive in France, Germany invaded Belgium, making them join the war against them. This invasion pulled Britain into the war as well, backing up Russia, France, and Belgium against the Central Powers. At this point, most of the major powers of Europe were at war. Italy would eventually join, however they allied with the Central Powers. Before I go further, just want to mention there's a lot of details to this story, like important leaders and negotiations, etc. One day in the future, I would love to make another podcast that goes fully into everything: World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea War, etc. It's fascinating to know everything that happened in these events, everyone's point of view, and how even today, humans still crave violence. We want to control everyone instead of living in unity, accepting our differences, living together, instead of making everything one way. Maybe one day I'll make a show dedicated to teaching you about the world's history of war. Because as the famous Fallout series always says, war never changes. As we advance in weaponry, technology, and even tactics, the core reasons humanity wages war against others always involves greed, lust for power, and resources others seek to acquire. During the years of 1914 to 1918, many different battles were happening all over the globe. I'm going to summarize each conflict so you can understand what the world was dealing with, because as we get closer to the end of the war, we get to the main point of this week's episode, the Spanish flu. But to understand the troubles people dealt with during the pandemic, one needs to understand the impact of the war. August 12th, the Austrians and the Serbs clashed in Serbia around an area called the Sur Mountains and around several villages in the area. This was the first initial battle just 3 weeks into the Great War. Austria suffered great losses. This reduced their strength against Russia. However, Serbia won this battle, but it was an unexpected win. Near the end of 1914 and into 1915, this battle saw the first use of anti-aircraft warfare, to which an Austrian plane was shot down from ground to air fire. During this time, Germany was also battling it out with Belgium and France. By the end of 1914, Germany had made their way into France and held a strong position within the nation. They controlled the bulk of France's coal fields and managed to inflict at least 230,000 casualties. However, the main objective was to avoid a two-front war. Germany failed to achieve this. Instead, they caused mass damage and became a real pain in the neck in future years. It's not like they would eventually cause another world war 20 years later because of some of the nation was power hungry and supported one of the worst humans ever. Nah, nothing like that ever could have happened. Near the end of the summer though, New Zealand took over Samoa, which was occupied by Germans at the time. This would start up the first naval battles. Germany would sink a Russian cruiser, which would also make Japan take up arms against them, and later Austria-Hungary. Near the end of the year, the Allies had reclaimed all German territories in the Pacific. Also, the British, the French, and the Germans were duking it out in Africa. These battles were German-controlled areas of southwest Africa where some parts of the continent supported the Central Powers. Germany also tried to bring India over to their side. However, as they had alliances with the British, they joined the Allies in the war. Now, there's a whole war history with India and the British. As far from my understanding, the British were the villains in that story, but I'll cover that another day. Now, one thing everyone thinks of when they hear World War I is the trenches. On the Western Front, trench warfare was taking place. This was made along the Belgian coast, and it stretched all the way to the Swiss border, running right into northern parts of France. The trenches were considered the theaters of war. This is where the true horrors lay during this time, and not in the war rooms. Trenches were dug 8 feet deep and about 4 to 6 feet wide. The trenches were reinforced with sandbags, wooden planks, and even barbed wire. They were also never a straight path. They were designed in a zigzag pattern. This design was put here in case enemies invaded your trench. You could hide around corners and lay down fire. For defense, there were fire steps so you could see over your trench. There was also a machine gun nest and listening posts posted beyond the front line so they could monitor the activities of the enemies. But the living conditions, I would say, are horrifying. Soldiers would often be living in muddy, water-clogged, blood-filled conditions. When they needed rest, oftentimes you were sleeping right on the ground in the watery filth, or a hole one would dig out just to avoid the potential sicknesses or even the dreaded trench foot. Your alarm clock was either gunfire or bombardments from aircraft, missile launchers, or heavy machine guns. If you were able to look at photos of soldiers before and after, the shocking changes will give you nightmares. If you never got terribly injured, needed any facial reconstruction or skin grafts, you were lucky. However, to those lucky few, they look like they aged extremely fast, caused by stress, fears, and PTSD from everyday wondering if this was your last. The surviving soldiers had to deal with the effects of shell shock. This is a psychological and physical breakdown of oneself, dealing with symptoms of extreme stress, the trauma of combat, the loss of comrades, tremors or uncontrollable shaking, sensory losses like going blind or deaf. There was even speech disorders like stuttering or mutinism. Not to mention the nightmares that were caused, amnesia, and emotional detachment, let alone trying to become a normal person again. Examples like walking or talking caused the veterans panic, fear, or just being emotionally detached from reality itself. Some managed to pull through this with lots of help, but to others, they lost touch on reality, essentially becoming a shell of their former selves. During this time, every able-bodied man was drafted into the war. Yes, a lot of volunteered, but a lot were forced to fight. At first, ages between 21 and 30 were drafted, later changing to 18 to 45. And besides the fears of getting shot at you and, dying, there were also the living conditions that I mentioned. The watery ground could give someone trench foot. This is when the feet are exposed to long periods of cold, damp environments. Blood vessels would constrict, reducing proper blood flow, and if your boots had holes or were worn down, things got worse. If your bare skin was exposed, received a cut or a wound, it could become gangrene and may need to be amputated. There was also trench fever, a sickness from the blood, sweat, and unsanitary conditions the trenches had. It was a bacteria called Bartonella quintenna. It's transmitted from human body louse, a wingless insect that feeds on human blood that could reside in soldiers' clothes. The symptoms of trench war would be high fever, headaches, pain, fatigue, etc. Needless to say, the war was beyond a horrific time, especially for the soldiers. As of today, this sickness isn't often seen in the public, but can be found around the homeless in some cases. As of November 1918, the war would finally come to an end. Many battles were fought globally, either on the Western Front in Europe or on the open seas, or within the war rooms. Approximately 15 to 22 million people had died during World War I. This included at 9 to 11 million military personnel and between 6 to 13 million civilians, not to mention the millions of soldiers that were injured. Many treaties would be made, empires had fallen, and countries went back to somewhat of a normal life. However, to the soldiers that were unaware of what was going outside the war, the world was dealing with another battle. Like I said, the war ended in November, but the Spanish flu was first reported in Haskell County in Kansas in the month of January 1918. The Spanish flu is considered a misleading name as it is also known as the Great Influenza Epidemic. It was a deadly influenza pandemic which was started by an H1N1 subtype of the influenza A virus. First reported cases started early in 1918 in Kansas, with later cases being found in France, Germany, and United Kingdom. It fully broke out near the end of World War I. Now, most countries did what they could to suppress bad news from reaching soldiers as it would decrease morale. However, in Spain, news was freely reported about the pandemic because Spain was neutral during the war, to which labeled Spain the epicenter and having the name of it becoming the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with its arrival. Just think, I know it's really hard to imagine this, but like what the soldiers had to deal with, but just imagine coming home after years of fighting, not knowing if today was your last day on earth, looking forward to being lazy, only to find out a deadly pandemic was going on. If there's a God, he was probably like, hey guys, great job with the war, but now go deal with this. Good luck. As I said, this virus was an influenza strain. It had symptoms similar to the seasonal flu. However, it was more severe. The most common symptoms were high fevers, chills, headaches, and muscle aches. If things became extreme, you could be dealing with extreme fatigue and malaise, dry persistent coughs, sore throats, and chest discomforts, even constant running nose. Moving to severe cases would have respiratory issues, chest pains, and pulmonary edema. Like this pandemic, it did have its trademark symptom. Cyanosis was a bluish discoloration of the skin, lips, and nails. This would be indicating patients with extremely low oxygen levels. You could also develop bacteria, pneumonia, vomiting, and diarrhea, delirium, or mental confusion. The worst part, in my opinion, is knowing as a soldier is that the virus would have spread faster due to the troops moving to other countries, to the battles that weren't on the Western Front trenches. The pandemic came in 3 waves, the first being relatively mild, but the second was the worst. The third, being like the first, mild as well. The first one began in March 1918 and mostly affected military camps in the U.S. like Camp Funston in Kansas. This wave was mild. Everyone thought, just regular flu, but they were wrong. And this first wave had no high mortality rates. In the fall of 1918, just shy of the end of the war, the second wave kicks in. The death toll started to climb, mostly affecting the young and the old between the ages of 20 and 40. This wave lasted until the end of the year and just a little bit into 1919. This wave brought the death up to an estimated 50 million people, including soldiers and civilians. The third wave kicked in winter of 1919 and in the spring. It did continue the death toll, but it did start to subside by the summer. It's estimated in the years of 1918 and just the beginning of 1920, the Spanish flu had between 50 to 100 million deaths globally. Besides the US, Europe was trying to rebuild itself from the war, and now also having to deal with this. It's unclear exactly where it first came from. The most common theory is that it came from China. In 2014, a historian from the Memorial University of Newfoundland named Mark Humphreys argued the claim that about 96,000 Chinese laborers that were recruited to work with the British and French during the war. His evidence was an archive that was recorded. He found reporting a respiratory illness that appeared in the northern regions of the country. However, as no tissue samples were survived, it's hard to determine in modern day if the claim was true. One thing that the Spanish flu and COVID had in common is that these people wore medical masks to prevent its spread. Remember when COVID, people were divided with the use of masks? Some believed it was a joke, and no one wears such a thing? Yeah, well, these people of this era wore them, and you can find pictures that included police and other authority figures wearing them and handing them out. Now, they didn't have the concept of social distancing, but the mask wear is nothing new. And remember from last week's episode, the plague doctors and their creepy bird getup, well, that was an early version of the hazmat suit. By the mid-1920s, it was determined that the pandemic was for the most part over. However, parts of Chile and South America were experiencing their third wave during the winter of 1920 into 1921. When seasonal flu kicked back in, the globe had started to panic of a deadly fourth wave, but nothing of such ever happened. It says globally at least 500 million people were affected by the pandemic. If we combine the death toll of the war and the pandemic, we're over at least 100 million people have died. However, we do know we had a huge population boom because of the boomers. All the soldiers couldn't stop fucking after the war. I mean, I don't blame them. I would too if I was fighting for my life and was just hoping to come home to my partner. Nothing cures PTSD like busting a nut. It's during this era, humans seem that, they could never catch a break. We spend years fighting our lives in the names of people that thought differently, either against the Central Powers or the Allies, only to eventually come home to deal with a deadly pandemic. And then a few years after that, the Great Depression kicked off in 1929. Because of economical failures, the Wall Street had crashed, and massive unemployment. And once the world had battled through this, it was only 10 years later World War II would happen, because Hitler wanted to take over the world, eradicate the Jewish, and make the world in his image. It seems like everything we do, humanity is always battling it out to survive the next problem, either being from whatever nature throws at us, or some country pissing off others, causing a war. It's thought we today are dealing with another Great Depression after the COVID-19 pandemic, to which we will explore this pandemic that shook up the modern world. As of 2026, we still blame it for our troubles that followed. But more of that will be discussed next week when we start part 3 of the Pandemic Nightmare series. Hit that subscribe button to get notified when new episodes drop, and feel free to send me stories that you want covered in future episodes to northernnightmares@outlook.com, because this is your home for nightmares, tales throughout Canada and beyond. I'll see you soon. Sweet dreams, and remember, nightmares are closer than you think.